A successful woman vanished in a city filled with cameras, surveillance, and constant digital tracking. But somehow, no one could clearly explain what truly happened to her. Emily Carter was known across New York as a respected investigative journalist. Her reputation was built on accuracy, persistence, and the ability to uncover truths that others avoided. To the outside world, her life appeared stable and controlled. She had a strong career, financial independence, and a professional identity that earned both admiration and pressure in equal measure. Yet beneath that stability, Emily was not living a simple life. She was quietly working on something far more dangerous than her public assignments suggested. Over months, she had been following a high-level corruption network connected to influential figures, hidden financial channels, and organizations that operated beyond normal accountability. At first, the warning signs were subtle. Anonymous messages arrived without clear origin, framed as advice rather than threats. Strange interruptions appeared in her research patterns. Small inconsistencies in her digital environment made her aware that she was being observed. Still, Emily continued forward, driven by the belief that truth required sacrifice. As her investigation deepened, the tone of the warnings shifted. They became more direct, less disguised. Instead of discouragement, they carried implication, suggesting consequences without ever naming them. Emily understood what that meant. She simply refused to stop. On her final night, she left her office later than usual. Surveillance records confirmed her movements with precision. She had gathered final pieces of evidence that seemed to connect multiple layers of corruption into a single structured system. Whatever she had discovered was significant enough to change the direction of her entire investigation. Security footage shows her entering her apartment building that night. She appears calm, focused, and unaware of any visible danger. The elevator records confirm her arrival on her floor. After that moment, there is no recorded footage of her leaving again. The absence is immediate and unsettling. Friends begin noticing her disappearance gradually. Calls go unanswered. Messages remain unread. At first, people assume she is working under pressure or avoiding contact due to deadlines. But as hours turn into days, concern replaces assumption. Her presence, once constant and reliable, becomes completely absent. When authorities are finally alerted, the initial classification is cautious. The case is labeled as suspicious disappearance, rather than confirmed death or abduction. There are no immediate signs of forced entry, struggle, or obvious external involvement. On paper, it appears unclear rather than violent. However, public attention quickly reshapes the narrative. Media outlets begin questioning whether Emily Carter disappeared accidentally, intentionally, or as part of a larger escape. Speculation spreads, but no verified explanation emerges. Each theory collapses under lack of evidence. What remains most disturbing is not what is found, but what is missing. Emily does not feel like a person who disappeared in a traditional sense. It feels as if she has been removed from the system entirely, erased from the expected flow of normal outcomes. Her last known contact provides a fragment of emotional truth. A brief message suggests fear, specifically directed toward something or someone with significant influence. There are no names, only implication. Enough to suggest she understood the risk she was facing, but not enough to identify it clearly. The investigation begins quietly. No official suspects are named, and no immediate conclusions are drawn. But behind the controlled public narrative, pressure begins building. Her case attracts attention not because of what is known, but because of what refuses to surface. As investigators review the apartment footage again, a detail becomes central. The entrance shows no forced entry, no visible intrusion, no disruption of physical security. Yet inside that space, something suggests a different truth entirely. Something that proves Emily Carter did not leave willingly. The investigation into Emily Carter's disappearance shifted the moment surveillance integrity was questioned. What began as a missing person case was now turning into something far more structured, where absence itself carried patterns that did not belong to chance. Detective Ryan Callahan took control of the case with a methodical approach shaped by years of experience dealing with irregular crime patterns. He did not focus on emotional assumptions or public pressure. Instead, he reconstructed the timeline through digital systems, treating every recorded second as evidence waiting to contradict itself. At first glance, the building's security records appeared intact. Emily's entry was confirmed. Her elevator movement was logged precisely. Her arrival on her floor matched timestamp continuity without visible disruption. Everything suggested normality, yet Callahan understood that systems designed too perfectly often concealed manipulation rather than truth. The first anomaly appeared when he expanded the access logs beyond resident activity. A secondary entry record surfaced from earlier that evening. It showed someone entering the building hours before Emily's disappearance. The timestamp was clean, the authorization field active, but the identity attached to it was incomplete. There was no match in any official database. No resident profile. No visitor registration. No employment clearance. No digital trace that could confirm the person even existed within standard identity systems. It was as if the entry had been recorded by infrastructure that recognized movement but not origin. Callahan ordered full surveillance extraction from every camera angle connected to the building. The footage confirmed what the logs suggested. A man had entered the lobby earlier that evening and moved with deliberate calm toward the elevators. He did not hesitate, did not interact, and did not trigger security concern. He appeared familiar with the building's structure despite having no recorded association with it. He reached Emily Carter's floor without obstruction. After that point, continuity failed. There was no recorded exit. No identifiable return path. No secondary movement through stairwells or service corridors. It was not a missing clip or damaged file. The system showed structured gaps, segments of time where footage appeared intact but functionally unusable for tracing movement. When Callahan interviewed neighbors from surrounding apartments, their responses added another layer of uncertainty. None reported loud conflict. No voices of struggle. No signs of forced intrusion. Yet several described a subtle disruption in atmosphere, an unnatural quietness that they could not fully explain but remembered clearly. Emily's apartment itself showed no visible external damage. The door frame was intact. Locks were untouched. Furniture remained arranged in a normal state. There was no sign of forced entry or physical confrontation. However, the internal condition told a different story. Something had been altered, not destroyed. Selective removal of items confirmed intent. Her laptop was gone. Specific research folders were missing. Certain documents had been extracted while others remained untouched, suggesting targeted selection rather than random theft. Whoever had entered knew exactly what to take. Callahan's interpretation of the case shifted at that point. This was no longer a disappearance driven by personal conflict or spontaneous crime. The structure indicated premeditated extraction based on information control. Emily Carter had not been taken randomly. She had been systematically processed. As the investigation widened, early suspicion moved away from emotional or domestic motives. Instead, attention turned toward organized interference. The precision of access logs, the controlled surveillance gaps, and the selective removal of evidence all pointed toward a coordinated operation beyond ordinary criminal capability. Authorities began considering the possibility of external influence operating with access to systems, infrastructure, or security channels that should have been restricted. The case was no longer isolated. It suggested involvement from a level of power that could manipulate both physical and digital environments without immediate detection. Then came the forensic breakthrough. During a secondary sweep of the apartment threshold, investigators recovered a single latent fingerprint preserved on a surface near the entry corridor. It was carefully extracted, processed, and run through national identification systems for verification. The result halted the entire investigation process. The fingerprint matched a profile that should not have existed in any active database. The identity attached to it was not just unknown, it was officially declared deceased several years earlier. The fingerprint discovery changed the direction of the entire investigation, but it also forced Detective Ryan Callahan to reconsider something more disturbing than identity: purpose. If someone officially declared dead had physically entered Emily Carter's building, then the case was no longer about disappearance alone. It was about intention designed to remain hidden from record. Interesting hook. Emily Carter was not simply investigating corruption. She was digging into a system capable of removing people not just physically, but completely from documented reality. Callahan redirected the entire case file toward Emily's professional history. Her journalism work, once viewed as independent investigative reporting, now appeared layered with deeper intent. She had not been covering isolated scandals. She had been following connections between corporate structures, financial systems, and political influence networks operating beneath public visibility. As her digital archives were reviewed, a pattern emerged. Emily had been tracking irregular financial flows tied to elite family holdings and multinational corporate entities. These transfers were not random anomalies. They followed structured pathways through offshore accounts, shell companies, and legal loopholes designed to disguise ownership and control. What made the case more serious was not just the money trail, but the consistency of the names involved. Multiple references appeared repeatedly across unrelated sectors: political donors, high-level executives, and organizations with direct or indirect access to legislative influence. This was not a simple corruption story. It was a network. Encrypted fragments recovered from Emily's partially restored system revealed her own awareness of escalating danger. Her notes were no longer just analytical, they were observational warnings. She had begun documenting behavioral changes in her environment, unexplained surveillance patterns, and subtle interference in her workflow. The tone of her writing shifted over time from investigation to caution. At one point, she explicitly recorded the feeling of being followed, even when no visible presence could be confirmed. That detail transformed her disappearance from a mystery into a consequence of awareness. Callahan began assembling decrypted files into a structured sequence. What appeared was not just evidence of corruption, but a coordinated system designed to remain insulated from exposure. Financial routes connected political influence with private enterprise in ways that ensured accountability could be redirected, delayed, or erased entirely. As more names surfaced, the case escalated beyond local jurisdiction. What Emily had uncovered was no longer an isolated journalistic investigation. It had implications that reached into national-level structures of power. That shift triggered immediate institutional pressure. Official channels began subtly discouraging deeper inquiry. Requests for case stabilization appeared from administrative levels outside standard investigative authority. Language used in correspondence suggested containment rather than resolution. The investigation was not being stopped directly. It was being slowed, redirected, and softened. At the same time, media behavior began to shift. Coverage around Emily Carter's disappearance decreased without formal announcement. Articles that once highlighted suspicion began rephrasing her case as uncertain rather than investigative. Public visibility was being reduced in controlled increments. Callahan recognized the pattern immediately. This was not coincidence. It was managed narrative suppression. Emily had not simply stumbled onto corruption. She had entered a system that actively protected itself through silence, influence, and structural pressure. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became. Someone had not only wanted Emily stopped, they had ensured her investigation would never reach completion. And then came the breakthrough that changed everything again. Among the recovered encrypted files, one partially restored document contained a single image file. It showed Emily Carter meeting a man she was never supposed to trust. The recovered image changed the direction of Detective Ryan Callahan's thinking once again. Emily Carter was no longer just a journalist who disappeared while chasing external corruption. The image suggested something far more personal. She had been interacting with someone she knew, someone who existed within her own trusted environment. Emotional hook. Emily's final investigation was not aimed at distant criminals. It was aimed at people she had once believed she could trust. Callahan began reconstructing Emily's professional network with renewed precision. This time, he did not focus only on external suspects. He studied her workplace relationships, editorial chains, communication logs, and collaborative patterns. What emerged was unsettling. Emily had not been working alone. She had informants close to her. People embedded within her professional circle had provided her access, guidance, and internal data. But those same connections also created vulnerability. If information had been leaked, it would not have required external intrusion. It could have originated from within her own trusted environment. Emily's personal case notes confirmed the suspicion. Among her encrypted writings was a recurring reference to an internal leak possibility. She had not been certain, but she had been observant enough to recognize inconsistencies between what she knew and what others around her were aware of. This shifted the investigation toward her workplace. Callahan and his team began questioning staff members within her journalistic organization. At first, responses appeared cooperative, but subtle behavioral patterns suggested discomfort. Some employees avoided direct answers. Others provided carefully structured responses that omitted key details without technically lying. One senior editor stood out immediately. He avoided direct questioning and repeatedly redirected conversations toward procedural details rather than Emily's actual work. His responses were polished but incomplete, as if certain parts of the truth had been deliberately excluded. When pressed further, his explanations became inconsistent, revealing gaps that could not be attributed to memory alone. The investigation deepened when Emily's final article draft was recovered from partial backups. The file had been heavily corrupted and selectively deleted, but fragments remained intact. What survived revealed more than expected. The article referenced a protected financial group, described in coded language rather than direct identification. The structure of her writing suggested she was preparing to expose a coordinated system involving financial influence, institutional protection, and elite-level shielding mechanisms. This was not ordinary investigative journalism. It was an exposure draft targeting a network that operated above standard accountability. Callahan realized the implications immediately. Emily had not only gathered evidence, she had been preparing to publish it. The timing of her disappearance now aligned directly with the final stages of publication readiness. The possibility became unavoidable. Someone had intervened to prevent release. Not after publication, before it ever reached the public. As the investigation progressed, emotional weight began to surface beneath the structural findings. Emily's persistence was no longer just professional determination. It reflected awareness of danger she had chosen to ignore in pursuit of truth. She knew the risks. She had recorded them. Yet she continued forward regardless. That realization reframed everything. Her disappearance was no longer accidental or reactive. It suggested premeditated silencing, an intentional removal designed to stop information rather than respond to consequences. Callahan began to see a pattern forming beneath all evidence. This was not a single act of violence or isolated crime. It was structured suppression, executed with precision across digital, institutional, and human layers. Emily Carter had been too close to something that was never meant to be exposed. And the system had responded accordingly. Later that night, while reviewing recovered communication logs, forensic analysts restored a previously deleted email fragment from Emily's account. It contained only one confirmed line of text. Emily Carter was asking for help from someone powerful enough to stop everything. The deeper Detective Ryan Callahan moved into Emily Carter's case, the more the investigation stopped behaving like a standard missing person file. Every new layer of evidence no longer pointed toward an individual crime. It pointed toward structure. Something larger, more coordinated, and deliberately hidden beneath layers of legitimacy. Emily Carter's disappearance was no longer an isolated event. It was now connected to a financial empire operating beyond the reach of law enforcement itself. Callahan expanded the investigation into corporate financial networks, tracing the protected financial group mentioned in Emily's recovered drafts. What initially appeared as separate companies slowly revealed a pattern of connection. Shell corporations, investment firms, and consultancy groups were all linked through indirect ownership structures and concealed financial pipelines. On paper, they looked independent. In reality, they moved like one system. Money did not just flow, it was guided. Transactions passed through multiple jurisdictions, disappearing and reappearing in ways that made ownership intentionally untraceable. Every path of investigation seemed designed to loop back into legal ambiguity rather than clarity. As Callahan mapped these connections, another pattern emerged. Each time Emily appeared close to identifying a node in the network, her progress aligned with a sudden interruption in data availability, communication loss, or document disappearance. It was not coincidence, it was coordination. Her case was now inseparable from systemic corruption. That realization changed everything about how the investigation was treated internally. Shortly after presenting his findings, Callahan received a formal advisory notice discouraging further escalation. It was not issued as an order, but as a warning framed in bureaucratic language. The message was clear without being explicit. Continuation of the investigation was no longer recommended. Then the pressure escalated. Anonymous threats began appearing through official communication channels. Some were subtle, embedded in procedural reminders. Others were more direct, referencing career stability, case sensitivity, and institutional boundaries. None of them explicitly referenced violence, but their meaning was unmistakable. At the same time, higher-level administrative authorities began shifting the narrative around Emily Carter's disappearance. Internal memos suggested reclassification toward an accidental disappearance scenario, despite the growing inconsistencies in evidence. The goal was no longer discovery, it was containment. Public-facing reports began reflecting that shift. Media outlets slowly transitioned their framing from investigation to uncertainty. Language changed from suspected foul play to unconfirmed circumstances, diluting urgency while preserving ambiguity. Callahan recognized the pattern immediately. This was narrative control. Despite mounting pressure, he refused to close the case. Instead, he redirected focus toward the only remaining stable lead, Emily's connection to external enforcement structures. That search led him to a private security organization operating in parallel to official law enforcement channels. The organization was not publicly visible in traditional systems, but its presence appeared indirectly across multiple elite contracts, political protection arrangements, and corporate security layers. It functioned less like a company and more like a silent enforcement mechanism for influential figures. The implication was unavoidable. If Emily had been removed by force, it would not have been random. It would have been executed through systems designed to protect secrecy rather than enforce law. The pattern now pointed toward organized protection of hidden structures. Then came the breakthrough that shifted the entire case again. While reviewing late-stage surveillance archives, Callahan accessed restored security footage from Emily's building on the night of her disappearance. The footage revealed something precise, controlled, and deeply unsettling. Emily Carter was seen meeting a man hours before she vanished. And according to all available records, that same man was still actively operating inside the system today. Just no longer theoretical. It was structural protection. The betrayal theory shifted from possibility to central focus. Emily's disappearance was no longer just a consequence of external discovery. It was increasingly shaped by internal compromise. Someone close enough to guide her work may also have guided her exposure. As this realization settled in, the emotional weight of the case deepened. Trust, once assumed within her circle, now became a variable under suspicion. Every connection she had relied on began to fracture under scrutiny. Detective Callahan reviewed the case again, but this time the question was different. Not who took Emily Carter, but who had access to her right before she was taken. Late that night, during a final sweep of recovered data, forensic analysts uncovered a partially restored audio file hidden within corrupted backups of Emily's system. It was labeled as a failed recording attempt. The discovery of the meeting changed the direction of the investigation, but it also created a deeper question Detective Ryan Callahan could no longer avoid. If Emily Carter had met someone willingly before her disappearance, then the case was not only about external force, it was also about internal access. The real danger in Emily Carter's life was not the unknown, it was someone she trusted completely. Callahan returned to Emily's professional network with a sharper focus. This time, he narrowed his attention to her closest working relationship, the individual who had consistent access to her schedules, research timelines, and confidential material. What appeared at first to be routine collaboration now carried a more unsettling possibility. That person had been close enough to guide her movements, and close enough to expose them. As communication records were re-examined, irregularities began to surface. Certain exchanges between Emily and her closest contact showed subtle inconsistencies in timing and tone. Messages that should have been routine updates contained gaps, delays, or unexplained formatting changes. On their own, they were minor. Together, they formed a pattern of controlled information flow. Then came the most critical detail. Just days before Emily disappeared, there were signs of external access to her research schedule. Not direct hacking, but coordinated visibility, suggesting that someone with authorized access had shared information intentionally or indirectly. The implications were immediate. Emily Carter had likely been exposed from within her trusted circle. That realization shifted the emotional weight of the investigation. Until now, suspicion had been directed outward, toward corporations, security systems, and unknown operators. But the possibility of betrayal inside her immediate environment introduced a far more personal form of danger. Callahan began interviewing individuals connected to Emily's workplace and personal research network. The responses varied, but a consistent pattern emerged. Some accounts were overly precise, as if rehearsed. Others were incomplete, avoiding specific references to her final weeks. A few testimonies directly contradicted one another in small but important details. None of them aligned fully. One detail stood out across multiple interviews. Emily had expressed concern that she was being watched. Not in a vague or emotional sense, but with specific caution recorded in both notes and verbal warnings. She had mentioned the feeling to at least one trusted contact. That warning, however, had either been dismissed or minimized at the time. It was not treated as urgent. That dismissal now carried new meaning. As financial records tied to Emily's investigation were re-evaluated, a hidden motive began to emerge. Certain individuals within her professional circle were indirectly connected to institutions benefiting from the same financial structures Emily had been investigating. The incentive to suppress or redirect her findings was. But when restored, it revealed something far more disturbing. It captured Emily Carter realizing she was being followed, in real time. The recovered recording changed the emotional direction of the investigation, but it also introduced a more unsettling possibility. Emily Carter had not only been aware of danger, she may have been living inside a timeline that had already been shaped before her disappearance. Evidence now suggested that Emily Carter's disappearance was not sudden at all. It had been scheduled. Detective Ryan Callahan reopened the entire case chronology, this time focusing not on what happened inside the apartment, but on what occurred before Emily ever entered it that night. The timestamps, surveillance patterns, and access logs began forming a structure that no longer resembled chaos. It resembled planning. The first inconsistency emerged in surveillance coverage. Certain blind spots within the building's camera network aligned too precisely with Emily's movements. These were not random failures. They appeared as deliberate interruptions, occurring only during specific time windows that matched her entry route. Further analysis revealed that elevator and hallway camera feeds had experienced micro-looping sequences. Short segments of footage were repeating in controlled patterns, effectively masking real-time activity during key transitions. This type of manipulation required access to internal security architecture. Someone had been inside the system. Callahan expanded the audit to building security controls, and what he found confirmed escalation. Administrative access logs showed temporary overrides issued shortly before Emily arrived home. These overrides were not broad system changes. They were precise adjustments targeting visibility at exact intervals. The implication was unavoidable. Someone had controlled the environment in advance. As reconstruction continued, Emily's movements began to align with predictive tracking rather than passive surveillance. Her path through the city that night matched patterns already reflected in access adjustments. It was as if her location had been monitored and anticipated in real time. This shifted the entire interpretation of the case. What had once appeared as a possible murder investigation now pointed toward planned extraction. Emily Carter had not been randomly targeted in a moment of opportunity. She had been guided into a controlled environment where visibility, access, and response were deliberately managed. Callahan reclassified the case internally, marking it as structured removal rather than spontaneous crime. The objective was no longer elimination alone. It was containment of information she possessed. Emily had likely been taken not just because of what she knew, but because of what she was about to reveal. Further evidence suggested involvement of a high-level protection mechanism operating beyond standard law enforcement jurisdiction. The precision of surveillance manipulation, combined with synchronized system control, indicated coordination between multiple entities rather than a single actor. At this stage, the case expanded beyond individual accountability. Multiple agencies may have been indirectly or directly compromised. That realization triggered a classification escalation within the investigative framework. Access to certain files was restricted. Communication channels became filtered. Internal reviews began requiring authorization beyond Callahan's rank. The message was clear without being spoken. The truth was being contained. Despite increasing resistance, Callahan pushed deeper into the remaining unrestricted data. What he discovered was a pre-assessment file attached to Emily Carter's identity profile, created shortly before her disappearance. It did not describe her as a journalist. It labeled her as a threat. And not just any threat. A threat to national stability. The classification was dated hours before she vanished. The classification label changed everything, but for Detective Ryan Callahan, it also removed the last illusion of ambiguity. Emily Carter had not been treated as a missing person by the system. She had been evaluated as a risk. Emily Carter didn't just disappear. She was removed because she knew something powerful enough to collapse entire systems of influence. Callahan returned to every fragment of evidence with a new understanding. The surveillance manipulation, the controlled access logs, the selective deletion of her research files, and the coordinated pressure on the investigation were no longer isolated anomalies. They formed a single structure of protection around something that was never meant to be exposed. Emily's investigation had reached deeper than expected. Her recovered drafts, encrypted notes, and partial communications all pointed toward one conclusion. She had uncovered the core of a corruption network that connected financial institutions, political influence channels, and private enforcement systems operating in parallel to official governance. This was not a scandal. It was infrastructure. A system designed to protect itself through layered influence, controlled narratives, and selective removal of threats. Emily had not simply documented it. She had approached a point where exposure was becoming possible. That was the turning point. Callahan now understood why her disappearance was not chaotic or emotional in nature. It was procedural. Structured elimination disguised as uncertainty. The objective had not been silence alone. It had been containment of knowledge. Emily Carter had been removed because she knew too much. Not about one person. About a system. As pressure on the investigation intensified, internal directives began pushing toward closure. Reports were revised. Language softened. Risk assessments were downgraded in official communication despite conflicting evidence. The intent was clear. Stabilize the narrative before it expanded beyond control. But Callahan no longer viewed the case as containable. He made a decision that carried personal and professional risk. Instead of fully complying with suppression protocols, he released a partial, carefully redacted summary of findings through unofficial channels. It did not expose names or classify details, but it confirmed something critical. Emily Carter had been investigating a coordinated structure of influence that operated beyond public accountability. The effect was immediate but subtle. Public awareness did not explode. It shifted. Conversations began forming online and within media circles, questioning inconsistencies in official explanations. The idea that Emily's disappearance was accidental began losing credibility, replaced by suspicion of controlled removal. Emily Carter's name started transforming into something larger than a case file. She was no longer just a missing journalist. She was becoming a symbol of suppressed truth, an example of what happens when investigation reaches systems built to remain unseen. Yet even as awareness grew, justice did not follow. Because the system responsible for her removal was still active, still operating, still protected. Callahan realized the most dangerous truth was not what Emily had discovered, but what remained untouched after her disappearance. Every layer they uncovered suggested that her investigation had stopped at the edge of something far larger than she ever had time to expose. The case even now was not truly closed. It was only contained. And containment could break. Late in the night, while reviewing the final recovered fragments of Emily's encrypted communication logs, Callahan accessed a message that had been partially restored from damaged data. It was brief, personal, and unmistakably final in tone. Emily Carter had written one name she trusted until the very end, and that name was still operating freely within the system today.